Let's get straight to the point. The American power grid is a house of cards, and it's getting ready to collapse. I'm not here to sell you fear. I'm here to deliver facts. For weeks, I've been digging into grid stability reports, infrastructure data, and talking to energy sector insiders who are quietly sounding the alarm. The official story is changing. The Department of Energy now admits that blackouts could increase by a factor of 100 before 2030. This isn't a minor uptick, it's a catastrophic failure in the making. The organization that oversees our entire electrical system has put most of the country on notice for elevated risk. We're not talking about a flickering light during a storm, we're talking about widespread extended outages when you need power the most. The grid was built for a world that no longer exists. We're shutting down reliable power plants and plugging in millions of electric cars, massive data centers, and power-hungry crypto mines. The math doesn't add up, and the consequences will be severe. In this video, I'm naming the 11 states facing the highest risk of being plunged into darkness in 2026. You need to know if you're one of them. Point 11. The Rust Belt's shocking transformation. Coming in at number 11 is a state many will find surprising. Michigan. Forget everything you think you know about the Great Lakes region. The industrial heartland is undergoing a seismic shift that is putting its power grid on a collision course with reality. Michigan's entire identity is being rewired for electric vehicle manufacturing, and this is happening at a scale that is difficult to comprehend. We're talking about Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis gutting their old-world factories and rebuilding them into colossal EV production hubs. These are not just assembly lines, they are power-hungry beasts. A single one of these new facilities will consume as much electricity as a small city, and there are multiple plants coming online. The demand surge from this industrial revolution alone is staggering, but it's only half of the equation. While Michigan is plugging in this unprecedented industrial load, it's simultaneously unplugging its reliable power sources. The state has been aggressively shutting down its coal-fired power plants and is phasing out nuclear capacity. What's replacing it? A heavy, almost desperate reliance on natural gas and some intermittent renewables. This creates the perfect storm. Michigan's natural gas pipeline infrastructure is dangerously old. A significant number of these pipes were put in the ground back in the 1950s and 60s, and they are not up to the task of handling the extreme weather events that are becoming the new norm. When a polar vortex descends and they are hitting with more frequency and intensity, the demand for natural gas for heating skyrockets. This is where the system breaks. The pipelines become constrained, and the gas-fired power plants, which are supposed to be the backbone of the grid, can't get enough fuel to generate electricity. This happens at the precise moment when electrical demand is also peaking from heaters running full blast. We saw a terrifying preview of this in 2014 when the grid came perilously close to a cascading failure. Utilities were forced to make panicked calls to major industrial users, begging them to shut down to prevent a total collapse. The warning signs couldn't be clearer. This is a system balanced on a knife's edge, where one cold snap could be the difference between the lights staying on and a statewide blackout in freezing temperatures. Point 10. The Bayou's fragile foundation. Next on the list at number 10 is Louisiana. If you think hurricanes are Louisiana's only problem, you are dangerously mistaken. The state's power grid is running on fumes, with some of the slimmest reliability margins in the entire country. This isn't a new development. It's a chronic condition rooted in decades of neglect. Much of Louisiana's critical power infrastructure is ancient, with many components dating back to the 1960s. This antique hardware is expected to perform in one of the most punishing environments imaginable. The state's real vulnerability, the one that keeps grid planners awake at night, is its almost total dependence on natural gas power plants that are sitting ducks for coastal flooding. Louisiana may be rich in natural gas, but the geniuses of a bygone era decided to build the majority of its generating stations in low-lying coastal areas, directly in the path of hurricanes. When a major storm hits, the threat isn't just high winds tearing down power lines. The existential threat is storm surge. We're talking about a wall of seawater that doesn't just flood a power plant, it completely submerges it. Salt water is brutally corrosive to complex electrical equipment, and the damage it causes is often absolute. After Hurricane Ida, it wasn't a matter of restringing a few wires. Entire generating facilities were destroyed, leaving some communities without power for over a month. Beyond the acute threat of storms, the everyday environment in Louisiana is actively working to destroy the grid. The relentless heat and oppressive humidity act as a constant corrosive agent, accelerating the decay of transformers, substations, and every other piece of equipment. Utilities are in a constant state of triage, patching up a system that needs a complete, multi-billion-dollar overhaul they can't afford. They are simply gambling that critical components won't fail during the summer peak, when air conditioning demand is non-negotiable. This is a recipe for a catastrophic failure that has nothing to do with a hurricane making landfall. The system is rotting from the inside out, and one blistering heat wave could be all it takes to trigger a widespread, prolonged outage. Point 9. The prairie state's deadly imbalance. Cracking our list at number 9 is a state that embodies the flawed logic of the modern energy transition. Illinois. The scale of the problem here is immense, starting with the metropolitan titan of Chicago, city that single-handedly consumes more electricity than many entire states. Illinois has been on an aggressive crusade to shut down its dependable coal plants, bowing to political pressure without first securing a viable replacement. The official solution has been a massive build-out of wind generation in the state's vast rural areas. On paper, it looks green and progressive. In reality, it's a logistical nightmare. The state has completely failed to build the necessary transmission infrastructure to move that wind power from the empty prairies to the population centers where it's actually needed. The current setup is like trying to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool with a drinking straw. The capacity simply isn't there. This fundamental mismatch creates a terrifying vulnerability during Illinois' brutal winters. When a polar vortex grips the state and temperatures plunge to 20 below zero, electricity demand for heating goes through the roof. This is when the house of cards collapses. The exact same high-pressure weather systems that bring the extreme cold also bring calm, still air, meaning the state's massive fleet of wind turbines stands motionless, generating absolutely nothing. This is not a rare occurrence, it's a predictable meteorological event. The grid then turns to its natural gas plants to pick up the slack. But just like in Michigan, the pipeline system cannot deliver enough fuel to meet the simultaneous demand for both heating and power generation. This is the potential for a triple-point failure: skyrocketing demand, zero wind production, and insufficient natural gas supply. This isn't theoretical. I've been tracking the grid alerts out of Illinois for years, and the near misses are becoming more frequent and more severe. Adding another layer of risk, the state's remaining nuclear fleet, which provides a staggering 50% of its electricity, is aging out. These plants are expensive to maintain, and several are already scheduled for retirement. Once these nuclear workhorses are gone, Illinois loses the bedrock of stable, dispatchable power that keeps the grid from collapsing. No amount of wind and solar can replace that kind of 24/7 reliability, and the politicians promising otherwise are selling a fantasy. Point 8. The Bay State's fuel gamble. At number 8, we have Massachusetts. While all of New England is skating on thin ice when it comes to grid stability, Massachusetts has engineered a uniquely perilous situation for itself. The state's leaders have systematically dismantled their own energy security in the name of environmental ideology. They have shut down their coal and nuclear power plants, which provided a reliable stream of electricity, and have simultaneously waged a war against the construction of new natural gas pipelines. This has left the state, and the entire region by extension, dangerously dependent on a single, fragile source of fuel: liquefied natural gas, LNG, delivered by massive tanker ships from foreign countries. Their energy policy is now at the mercy of global shipping lanes, international politics, and volatile price markets. This is not a secure position. This dependence becomes a crisis during New England's harsh winters. When a major winter storm or a bomb cyclone churns up the Atlantic, it can easily prevent these crucial LNG tankers from docking. If a shipment is delayed, or if a geopolitical event in another part of the world causes LNG prices to spike, Massachusetts literally risks running out of fuel to keep the lights on and the heat running. The regional grid operator, ISO New England, has been screaming about this vulnerability for years, issuing stark warnings that the region is just one pipeline failure or one delayed LNG shipment away from being forced to implement rolling blackouts during the coldest days of the year. They came terrifyingly close in 2022, with emergency protocols for rotating power cuts being prepped for activation. But the self-inflicted wounds don't stop there. The state is adding massive new loads to its already stressed grid by aggressively pushing electric vehicles and the conversion of homes from oil and gas heat to electric heat pumps. This is like installing a jet engine in a 1980s station wagon and expecting it to hold together. The distribution network at the local level was never designed to handle this kind of demand. It's a catastrophic failure waiting to happen, all because of a dangerous gamble on a fuel source that has to cross an ocean to get there. Point 7. The Empire State's precarious power balance. Securing the number 7 spot is New York. And let's be clear, this isn't just about New York City. Although the 5 boroughs represent a terrifying concentration of risk, the entire state is running on a power grid that is stretched to its absolute breaking point. A fragile system held together by aging infrastructure and wishful thinking. The state's leadership made a monumental blunder by shutting down the Indian Point nuclear power plant, a facility that single-handedly supplied a quarter of New York City's electricity with unwavering reliability. The promise was that this massive, stable power source would be replaced by clean renewables and natural gas. The reality is a disaster. The renewable goals are nowhere near being met, leaving the state dangerously dependent on a few natural gas plants and, more critically, on a transmission system that is groaning under the strain. The high-voltage arteries that pump electricity from generation sources upstate down to the city are operating at their maximum capacity, especially during summer heat waves. These lines, snaking through the Hudson Valley, have no margin for error. A single major transmission failure, a scenario that becomes more likely with each passing year as this 1960s-era equipment degrades, could instantly sever the power flow to millions, plunging the city into darkness. What truly makes New York a top-tier risk is the potential for a cascading failure. The grid is so tightly wound, so interconnected, and operating so close to its limits that a small localized problem can trigger a chain reaction, creating a blackout of unimaginable scale. We all remember the 2003 Northeast blackout, which started with a single sagging power line hitting a tree in Ohio and ended with 50 million people losing power. Today, New York's grid is even more vulnerable because demand has relentlessly climbed while the essential redundancy, the built-in safety margins, has been systematically stripped away. For New York City, the nightmare scenario is already happening in slow motion. During every heat wave, the ancient underground distribution network, a maze of cables and transformers never designed for modern power loads, begins to fail. The equipment literally cooks itself to the point of destruction, forcing utility Con Edison into a desperate damage control mode. They have to preemptively cut power to entire neighborhoods, initiating rolling blackouts, just to prevent their own equipment from exploding in underground vaults. This isn't a future threat, it's the current reality. They are choosing who gets power and who swelters in the dark, and that is a terrifying preview of what's to come. Point 6. The Sunshine State's overload condition. Sliding into the number 6 position is Florida. Most people immediately think of hurricanes. And while the storms are a massive factor, they are merely an accelerant for the real crisis. Florida's fundamental problem is a runaway explosion in population that its power grid simply cannot handle. The state is adding nearly 1,000 new residents every single day. That's 1,000 new homes, 1,000 new central air conditioning units running non-stop, 1,000 new pool pumps, and an ever-growing number of electric vehicles all plugging into a system that was already strained. This relentless growth is happening in an environment that is actively hostile to electrical infrastructure. The combination of intense, year-round heat and suffocating humidity is brutal on equipment. It acts as a catalyst, accelerating the degradation of transformers, substations, and transmission lines. Add to that the corrosive salt air that blankets the entire coastline, eating away at any metal component, and you have a recipe for constant systemic decay. Utilities are fighting a losing war against nature, spending fortunes just to keep the existing grid from falling apart, let alone trying to upgrade it to handle the tsunami of new demand. This structural weakness is compounded by Florida's over-reliance on natural gas for power generation. The vast majority of the state's electricity comes from gas-fired plants, and the fuel for those plants arrives via a handful of critical pipelines. Where are those pipelines located? They run directly through the same coastal zones and hurricane alleys that are battered by storms year after year. When a hurricane makes landfall, the danger isn't just that it will knock down power poles. The greater threat is that it will damage the gas pipelines or the compressor stations that keep the fuel flowing, starving the power plants and causing a statewide generation failure. Hurricane Ian was a brutal lesson in this reality. Areas that weren't even in the direct path of the storm lost power for weeks because the grid had zero flexibility. The transmission system was so brittle that it couldn't reroute power around the damaged section. The state's largest utility, Florida Power and Light, talks a big game about hardening the grid, but they are decades and tens of billions of dollars behind where they need to be. It's a band-aid on a hemorrhage, and the patient is bleeding out. Point 5. The desert's deadly dilemma. At number 5 is a state whose situation is frankly terrifying. Arizona. The Valley of the Sun is on the verge of becoming the Valley of Darkness if its leaders don't wake up to the crisis they've created. Phoenix is already one of the hottest major cities on the planet, with summer temperatures that routinely soar past 115 degrees. In this environment, air conditioning isn't a luxury. It is a life support system. Yet, into this extreme environment, the state continues to welcome hundreds of thousands of new residents, all while its water supplies are evaporating and its power grid is screaming for relief. When the power goes out in Phoenix in July, people die. It's that simple. Hospitals are overrun, emergency services collapse, and the most vulnerable, the elderly and the sick, are left in a lethal situation. We saw this play out during the heat waves of 2020, when equipment failures led to rolling blackouts and a direct, measurable spike in heat-related deaths. The entire state's power supply hinges on the performance of one facility, the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station. It's the single largest power plant in the United States, a true behemoth of energy production. But here is the secret no one wants to talk about. Palo Verde needs a massive amount of water for cooling, and it gets that water from the treated wastewater of the city of Phoenix. In the face of a historic, multi-decade drought, that water supply is no longer a guarantee. If that water is disrupted for any reason, the plant must power down or shut down completely. Imagine losing nearly 4,000 megawatts of constant, reliable power right as a heat dome settles over the state and temperatures hit 120 degrees. It would be an unprecedented catastrophe. To make matters worse, the state's big bet on solar power is a flawed solution. While it seems logical in a desert, solar panels lose efficiency as temperatures climb. On a 115-degree day, a solar panel's output can drop by 30% or more. And of course, solar produces zero electricity after sunset, just as millions of people are cranking their AC units to survive the night. This leaves the state utterly dependent on an aging, overloaded transmission network, with lines built in the 60s and 70s that are literally baking in the desert sun, degrading faster than anywhere else in the country. The grid is on life support, and the plug is about to be pulled. Point 4. The Tar Heel State's triple threat. Coming in at number 4 is a state that might seem stable on the surface but is secretly ground zero for a collision of grid-killing threats. North Carolina. For years, the state has been aggressively shutting down its reliable coal-fired power plants, replacing them with a fragile combination of solar farms and an ever-growing dependence on natural gas. The critical flaw in this plan is that North Carolina's natural gas pipeline capacity is completely insufficient for its needs. The state is at the tail end of the pipeline network, and it's not getting the infrastructure upgrades it needs to match its growth. Duke Energy, the state's primary utility, has publicly admitted that it is walking a razor's edge every winter, balancing supply and demand with almost no margin for error. They are one pipeline disruption or one severe cold snap away from a massive power shortfall that would necessitate widespread blackouts. The 2021 Colonial Pipeline hack, which crippled fuel supplies across the Southeast, was a stark warning. A similar attack targeting natural gas infrastructure would be an instant lights-out event for huge swaths of North Carolina. This vulnerability is being amplified by the state's explosive population and economic growth. The Research Triangle and Charlotte metro areas are magnets for high-tech industry, attracting power-hungry data centers, biotech firms, and advanced manufacturing facilities that consume electricity on an industrial scale. The local grid infrastructure is buckling under this new load, falling further behind with each passing year. But the most chilling threat facing North Carolina is the one that has already been proven: physical attack. In December 2022, attackers used common rifles to shoot up 2 critical substations in Moore County, plunging 45,000 people into darkness for nearly a week during cold weather. This was not a sophisticated attack, yet it was devastatingly effective. It exposed the soft underbelly of our entire grid. Thousands of substations, many in remote areas, protected by little more than a chain-link fence. A coordinated attack on just a handful of these vital nodes could easily cripple a major city like Charlotte or Raleigh. This is a new and terrifying reality, one that the grid was never designed to defend against. North Carolina is facing a triple threat: a fragile fuel supply, runaway demand, and a proven vulnerability to physical sabotage. It's not a question of if these factors will lead to a major blackout, but when. Point 3. The Lone Star State's reckless gamble. Claiming the number 3 spot is the one state that insists on going it alone: Texas. This could have easily been number 1, and frankly it's a coin toss. The Texas grid, known as ERCOT, is a world unto itself, intentionally isolated from the rest of the country's electrical system. This fierce independence is celebrated as a badge of honor, but in reality, it's a catastrophic liability. When the system in Texas fails, and it fails with alarming regularity, there is no cavalry coming. No neighboring state can send emergency power to help. They are entirely on their own. Trapped in a system of their own design. The world saw the consequences of this arrogance in February 2021, when a winter storm triggered a complete and total grid collapse. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a humanitarian disaster. More than 200 people froze to death in their own homes. Millions were left without power, heat, or running water for days on end. As temperatures plunged, the aftermath was a predictable circus of political excuses and finger-pointing, but the one thing that didn't happen was a fundamental fix to the problem. The Texas power market is a free-for-all, a deregulated casino that prioritizes cheap, wholesale electricity above all else, especially reliability. Power generation companies make their money by cutting corners and slashing operational costs, not by investing in resilient weatherized infrastructure that can withstand extreme conditions. There is no legal requirement to have backup power reserves for an emergency. The system is intentionally designed to run on the bleeding edge, with supply barely meeting demand. When one piece of this fragile puzzle breaks, the entire structure implodes. While winter gets the headlines, summer in Texas is just as dangerous. As scorching heat waves bake the state, electricity demand shatters records year after year. ERCOT's response is to issue constant conservation alerts, pathetically pleading with citizens and businesses to use less power to prevent another collapse. This isn't a sign of a well-managed grid, it's the death rattle of a system on life support. The state's massive bet on wind power has only added another layer of chaos. Gigantic wind farms in West Texas produce enormous amounts of power, but the transmission lines needed to get that power to the cities where people actually live are woefully inadequate. And when the wind inevitably stops blowing during a 105-degree afternoon, there isn't enough reliable backup generation ready to take its place because the natural gas plants that are supposed to be the fail-safe were never properly winterized or hardened. Texas is adding population faster than any other state, packing more and more demand onto a foundation made of sand. Another 2021-style event isn't a possibility, it's an inevitability. Point 2. The Golden State's ideological death spiral. It should surprise no one that California secures the number 2 spot on this list. But let me be clear, the reality on the ground is far worse than you've been led to believe. The state is in an active, self-inflicted death spiral, driven by an ideological crusade that has completely detached from engineering reality. California's political class is forcing the nation's most aggressive transition to renewable energy, systematically shutting down reliable nuclear and natural gas power plants and gambling the lives of 40 million people on wind and solar. The problem is the large-scale battery storage needed to back up these intermittent sources for more than a few hours doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. As a result, the grid has become dangerously unstable and, in a twisted turn of events, has become a weapon against its own citizens. The ever-present threat of wildfires, often started by aging utility equipment, has led to a policy of public safety power shutoffs. Think about that. The largest economy in the United States, a supposed global leader in technology, now routinely and preemptively cuts power to millions of its own people because it cannot guarantee its grid won't incinerate them. This isn't a third-world problem. This is a California problem, happening right now. These are not brief, momentary outages. We're talking about planned blackouts that can last for days, leaving people without refrigeration, medical equipment, or the ability to work. This has become the new normal, a managed decline in the standard of living that residents are simply expected to accept. The state's obsession with solar has created a bizarre and volatile grid condition known as the duck curve. During the middle of the day, solar panels flood the grid with so much electricity that the state sometimes has to pay its neighbors to take the excess power. But as the sun begins to set, Solar generation plummets to zero right as millions of people get home from work and turn on their lights, appliances, and air conditioners. This creates a vertical cliff of demand that the grid must meet in a matter of minutes, forcing an insane scramble to fire up every available natural gas plant. This daily cycle puts incredible stress on the equipment and dramatically increases the risk of a catastrophic failure. On top of all this, the state is mandating a future that its own grid cannot support. They are banning natural gas appliances and forcing everyone into electric vehicles, electric stoves, and electric heat pumps, all while openly admitting the grid is already past its breaking point. It is a policy of pure insanity, mandating explosive demand growth while making the power supply progressively weaker and less reliable. Point 1. The architect of collapse. And now for number 1. I could say it's Texas, because of its reckless isolation. I could say it's California because of its suicidal energy policies. In truth, they are in a dead heat, racing each other to the bottom. But for the top spot, I'm giving the edge to California, for one simple reason. While Texas at least pays lip service to building new generation, California is actively and gleefully dismantling its reliable power sources with no viable replacement. It is the architect of its own collapse, a state choosing to plunge itself into darkness out of pure political ideology. However, the real number one threat isn't a single state. The most terrifying vulnerability, the one that keeps serious experts up at night, is the fragile, interconnected nature of the entire national grid. The system that was designed to share power and provide stability is now a transmission vector for catastrophe. The regional grids, the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and Texas's ERCOT are incredibly complex machines. A failure in one state doesn't stay in that state. A major blackout in Illinois could destabilize the grid in Ohio. A crisis in Arizona could cascade into Southern California. We saw this in 2003 when a tree branch in Ohio knocked out power for 50 million people across the Northeast and into Canada. Today, the system is stretched much thinner, with far less reserve capacity and far more intermittent, unpredictable generation from wind and solar. A major event, be it a physical attack on critical substations like we saw in North Carolina, a sophisticated cyber attack, or an extreme weather event that cripples multiple states at once, could trigger a cascading failure that spreads like a virus across an entire half of the country. This is the nightmare scenario. A regional blackout that lasts not for hours or days, but for weeks. In this situation, our modern world evaporates, supply chains halt instantly. Grocery stores are stripped bare in hours. Without power, there are no credit card transactions, no cash from ATMs, no fuel pumps, and no running water. This isn't fear-mongering. This is the direct, predictable consequence of running a 21st century society on a fragile, neglected 20th century electrical system. The single greatest threat is the illusion of stability we've been sold, and the first state to trigger that regional collapse is the one you need to be prepared for, no matter where you live.